Hello, and welcome to everyone joining today's HEOR Theater presentation. Before we officially start the session, there are a few quick housekeeping items. All attendees have been joined to the HEOR Theater in listen-only mode. You can use the View Options setting on your own device to adjust the view. We encourage you to submit questions to the panelists via the Q&A feature. Panelists will answer as many questions as possible during the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be sent to all registrants via email tomorrow. The recording will also be available to view on demand in the ISPOR HEOR Solutions Center. And now we will begin the HEOR Theater presentation sponsored by Certara Evidence and Access.
Welcome to the SPOR HEOR Theater. The topic for today is external control arms, the case for a standardized lexicon and toolkit. I am Sumeet Bakshi. I'm Vice President for Real World Data Solutions at Certara EVA, and have been working with this team for the last 10 years, 11 years or so. Prior to that, qualified as a physician and have been working with the pharmaceutical industry for the previous decade. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Artak Khachatryan, my colleague who will be taking us through this presentation. Artak is also a surgeon by background and has succeeded in the art of dissecting numbers and statistics and real world data. I'll hand it over to Artak to introduce himself and then take us through this presentation.
Artak, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sumeet, and thank you everyone for joining us today. During this presentation, we will go through terminology, classification of external control arms. We will provide regulatory agencies and payers context, overview of guidelines and selected case studies, key success factors and methodological considerations, limitations, and also provide examples of some toolkits, especially the ones reflecting feasibility assessment, analytical decisions, and overall operational framework. Speaking of terminology, external control arm, historical control arm, synthetic control arm, natural history controls, external comparators. Do this terminology mean the same thing, or do they mean something different? In reality, there is no distinct definition used or agreed, and all these terms are used interchangeably. And in order to understand the exact meaning of each of these terms under each particular circumstances, you need to go to deep dive into the context. And this raises the need for harmonization of lexicon. In essence, external control arm is a broader concept, is an umbrella term which denotes two various terms to define patient control groups who are not part of the same trial. They could be observed contemporaneously and called contemporaneous control arm, or earlier than trial population and constitute historical control arm. There could also be synthetic control arm, which includes modeling, simulation of control arms, meta-analysis of published data, as well as pooled trial data. And depending on clinical context and context of regulatory requirement, all these studies can be benchmark studies, which will provide contextual comparisons via, for example, natural history studies, or could involve direct comparison via direct hypothesis testing. All these trials also could involve single control arm or multiple control arms via hybrid approach. And these multiple control arms could be in a form of different combination of different types of external control arms, for example, historical control arm and synthetic control arm, or it could be a combination of external control arm with traditional control arm in an RCT to increase efficiency of the trial. Regulatory agencies publish a number of papers regarding the merits and potential limitations of evidence approaches, assessing fitness of real-world data for use in regulatory decisions, for example, in terms of evaluating sources of data, data reliability, and data standardization. In the US, 21st century cures have provided legal basis and facilitated development of guidance and use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making since 2016. And subsequently, a framework for FDA real-world evidence program was developed in 2018 to evaluate potential use of such evidence to support changes in approved labeling or to support new drug approval. This also created and generated number of partnership, especially between academia and industry. For example, Duke Margolis real-world evidence initiative on bolstering real-world evidence study credibility. Also, as you know, FDA started producing and drafting various guidances, and the latest one on real-world data, assessing electronic health records and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making. Probably some of you already saw this. It is open to public consultation right now. Similarly, European Medicine Agency has convened public workshops since 2017 to discuss real-world evidence approaches and the use of big data concept. They also included promotion of use of high-quality real-world data in decision-making as part of their strategic reflection on regulatory science to 2025. And EMA also started producing various guidances on real-world data, and the very latest one on generating high-quality evidence from registry-based studies, which was released just very, very recently. And all this reflects willingness and flexibility in approaches of regulatory agencies to different evidence requirements for decision-making. Multiple areas are covered on all this in all these guidances, and this real-world evidence can be used as part of evidence lifecycle, for example, to complement pivotal RCTs for licensing. They can also be used to support effectiveness or to assess safety, including, for example, single-arm trials with external control, or studies with pragmatic designs, observational studies like post-authorization safety or effectiveness studies. Real-world evidence is generally more acceptable for when RCT is not feasible. For example, in case of rarity of condition, time it would take, ethical consideration, in terms of conditions with poor prognosis, high unmet need. Also, when comparison is a hard endpoint, meaning that endpoints are objective and comparable between trial and external control population, and of course, well thought out proposal and trust in their feasibility. While considering the opportunities for the use of external control arms, we need to also remember about limitations, which were highlighted in a number of documents by the agencies. The following are a couple of extracts from framework of FDA's real-world evidence program. They specifically mentioned that external controls, for example, historical controls, are a possible type of control arm in an adequate and well-controlled study. Typically, they mentioned external control arm uses data from past traditional trials. However, in some cases, real-world data have been used as a basis of external control arms. They also highlight importance of analytical and statistical methods such as propensity analysis to improve comparability of population. And they specifically mentioned that using external control arms has limitations, including difficulties in reliably selecting a comparable population because of potential changes in medical practice, lack of standardized definitions and diagnostic criteria for outcome measures, and variability in follow-up procedures. EMA has also issued the guidances on the choice of control group in clinical trials since 2001, and also approved some products using external control arms such as Blincito, Brinuera, Yescarta, and so on. And they also reflected potential use and limitation of historical control arms in their prime guidance on priority medicine. According to EMA guidances, external control arms are most likely to be persuasive where study endpoint is objective, outcome on treatment is markedly different from that of external control, high level of statistical significance for the treatment control comparison is attained, covariance influencing outcome of the disease are well characterized, and control arm is closely resembles the study characteristics. HTA agencies such as IQWiC in Germany or Canadian HTA have set some directions for the use of external control arms. For example, IQWiC in their guidance considers RCTs as a gold standard. However, they also mention that other type of design may be acceptable in exceptional circumstances, such as impossibility to implement or cases where effects are observed, for example, very high mortality without any intervention. And they mentioned that historical control arms are possible if patient population studied in past are sufficiently similar to patient population currently being treated, data is of sufficient quality, specific data relevant to current study, for example, information on confounders is available from historical data sets, and data is sufficiently similar, for example, in terms of definition of outcomes, confounders, similar to trial data. Canadian agency also considered some of these possibilities, but they also mentioned a couple of other considerations, which I want to highlight. For example, Canadian HTA may consider the possibility of external control arms when evaluation requires long-term follow-up or there is uncertainty regarding the persistence of efficacy due to short-term clinical trials, also when RCTs have limited external validity. External control arms have been used at different phases, at different stages of designing and conducting pivotal trials, and also until the registration and access pricing negotiations. We also, as a company, consulted clients at all these different phases, and we provided both consultancy in terms of design of protocol, and also we actual implementation of the study through all these phases. And below, I provided few examples of the conditions which we use external control arm for. For example, rare brain tumors, rare life-threatening viral infections, neuroendocrine tumors, also rare types of bladder cancer, relapse refractory hematological cancers. As you can see, one word is consistently used here is rare, which means that all these conditions are really very rare conditions. They are conditions with poor prognosis and conditions where effective treatments are not available. The following few slides will provide some of the examples which were both published in the literature and also examples from our own experience for us to provide some key factors to identify some key success factors which will maximize successes of studies using external control arm, and also some lessons learned. For example, in this slide, example of Tasveric in Blissito. Tasveric is a drug aimed at metastatic or locally advanced epithelioid sarcoma, not eligible for complete resection. This study there was a single-arm trial with historical control arm via natural history study conducted. However, the study was not accepted by FDA, citing number of design consideration, and one of the key reasons was that real-world objective response rate was not comparable to objective response rate observed in clinical trials due to differences in imaging frequencies and differences in how the endpoints are measured. And on the other hand, this Blissito example, which is very frequently cited as key success example of studies using historical control arm and external control arms in general. It was approved on the basis of single-arm trial with robust results and the use of historical control-based analysis to support efficacy. They provided in the design considerations, they used strict inclusion criteria. And however, even with the strict inclusion criteria, there were some differences in baseline characteristics between the trial and historical control arm. So they had to use appropriate analytical approaches, for example, weighting, adjusting for prognostic factors, propensity analysis. Also in terms of outcome definitions, while overall survival had the same definition as in trial, complete response rate was similar, but not exactly the same as in trial. However, the study provided marked differences in rate of outcomes between historical control and trial, more than twice in complete response rate and almost twice in overall survival. And these marked differences, along with analytical design consideration used, were some of the key factors which led to approval of this drug based on single-arm trial and historical control arm trial. Just to sum up here on this slide, as you can see, chances of success can be maximized by well-defined and comparable endpoints, appropriate analytical techniques used, and demonstration of marked observed differences. To continue the success story of Blincito, in fact, maybe not all of you know, but the part of an application package contained not only historical control arm, but also synthetic control arm, and which was actually developed by us and via model-based meta-analysis. And the use of both historical control arm and synthetic control arm was referenced by FDA and TMI as an impact factor for the approval process. And if we go back to the classification of external control arm, here is an example of using multiple control arms via hybrid approach, i.e. historical and synthetic control arms, which were part of successful approval process. Additional learnings comes from this very rare pediatric condition and the drugs used to treat very rare pediatric condition, strain 6, which was used to hypophosphatemia. This drug was approved under exceptional circumstances by EMA based on main study, which was a single-arm trial of only 13 patients, children. And historical control arm also contained only 16 children. And the study looks at differences in joint growth and so on, and they found differences even within this such a small population of patients. So extreme rarity of this condition can be factors of influencing external control arm design. And of course, EMA has requested and company will set up a registry of patients with hypophosphatemia to collect information on disease and on the long-term safety and effectiveness outcomes. The following few slides will provide a case study which we conducted, and I thought it would be very useful to share this with you. This is a use of historical control arm via natural history study design for evidence generation in the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation setting. Why this study is important? Because it shows the thinking process and the multi-step approach used from the very beginning, from the setting the problem and to developing approaches and providing the results. Client situation. This was a new drug for a rare life-threatening viral infection condition which has no approved therapies in hematopoietic stem cell transplantation setting. The client has a phase 2 control trial in the US. However, recruitment of controls in the trial was inadequate, and it was that EU would be required by EMA and HDS. So the approach was to seek advice through the combined EMA-HDA joint scientific pilots. Here are the sample questions which were included in this pilot: relevance of external control arm plan, relevance of existing control arm, and any design consideration in terms of population, sample size, subgroups, alternative approaches, for example, simulation, other evidence-based requirements. And as a result, the feedback confirms that the control arm should include European patient with specific comments on design requirement. And subsequently, we developed a multi-country chart review via a European natural history study, as well as to validate US-based control arms. These are the three main steps of the project. At the first steps, we compiled an allo-HCT registry. We compiled first the list of transplant centers in Europe, conducted in-depth feasibility assessment in terms of number of patients available, in terms of standard of care in centers, practice patterns, and also key variables availabilities. Following evaluation of feasibility assessment, we developed final list of centers and created an allo-HCT registry. This registry contains more than 4,000 of patients, including more than 1,700 pediatric patients and more than 2,500 adult patients. 500 patients out of more than 4,000 were identified as having rare viral infection post-transplant, and among them, more than 240 patients met viral load of the trial. And all these patients underwent very detailed chart review. And a number of analyses were conducted. We made presentations in conferences, number of peer-reviewed journals. Articles were published in number of peer-reviewed journals, which included descriptive practice pattern analysis, multivariate model to assess association between viral load and mortality, also to assess association between transplant and baseline characteristics and incidence of infection. And as a third step, this real-world data was used to optimize design, which was conducted in US. It was informed how patient characteristics impact viral load and how viral load impact mortality. These all aimed to maximize chances of phase 2 success and enhance real-world relevance for the study. As you can see through all these guidances or these case studies, there are a number of operational and methodological considerations that needs to be taken into account. And need for feasibility assessment is crucial in terms of data sources, availability of centers, patients, variables, availability of and comparability of study populations, sufficient data on key variables, and understanding of standard of care and changes in standard of care. Efficient use of appropriate analytical tools, and this all raises the need for harmonization and provision to assist in the choice of design and conduct of studies with external control arms. Following few slides will provide some examples of toolkits which could be used in conducting historical or contemporaneous control arm. They are not directly relevant for synthetic control arms, as synthetic control arms will require some specific additional consideration, and as soon as toolkits for control arms are ready, we may provide some additional separate presentations on this. Feasibility assessment. Feasibility assessment are highly encouraged and in fact a must. In all studies include external control, we always conducted feasibility assessment, and all our studies were involved two-step approach. Step 1 was feasibility assessment and step 2 was the main study. Feasibility assessment allows of uncertainties about standard of care. This could be done via simple feasibility survey or design a standalone feasibility or pilot study. You can also use and conduct it in number of separate database studies to understand better treatment patterns in different conditions. And what is also key to understand standard of care and their changes over time, to be able to choose appropriate time frame, which will match as closely as possible with the time frame of clinical trial. Feasibility assessment will also allow to assess uncertainties about availability of some key variables, such as availability of key variables to define study population, to define study outcomes, also to define key confounding and effect modifying variables. And also a feasibility assessment will allow you to conduct some further assessment, for example, number of eligible patients available within the time frame of interest, any potential selection bias due to the inclusion-exclusion criteria of centers and patients, duration of follow-up available, potential losses of follow-up, also any data privacy and data governance related issues, such as data sharing, which could be also useful in the conduct of these studies. Which could help us in making decision what kind of analytical methods to use in each different circumstances. Here is a default analysis approach of one-to-one or one-to-n matching. If inclusion and exclusion criteria are operational and adequate sample size is achieved after applying matching variables and everything is fine, so you can go ahead with one-to-one matching, but we all know that in practice, one-to-one matching frequently is not feasible. And in this case, there could be other approaches to consider. For example, if default approach is not feasible due to operational constraints, for example, due to an impossibility to actually link two data together, data from external control arm and trial data, then weighting analysis may be conducted. Or, for example, default approach is not feasible due to limited sample size, then propensity score matching could be conducted. And you can also conduct simulation of control arms as a sensitivity analysis to ascertain the results. And the last toolkit, which was operational framework, key decision, key questions needs to be considered, and consideration needs to be taken, and also key operational steps to be considered based on our practical experience, which we thought would be useful to share with you too. And we definitely, from the very early stages, we will strongly advise development teams to consider these concepts, to ask these questions from the very early on. For example, is RCTs feasible? If yes, is pivotal RCTs enough, or maybe perhaps there could be some supplementary requirements needed, or maybe RCT may be still feasible, but you could anticipate some problems in recruitment of control arms. In this case, perhaps you may also consider hybrid approach, for example, combination of traditional control arm and external control arm, which will reduce need for sample size control arm, increase efficiency of the trial, and at the same time keep power of the study up. Or RCT may not be feasible. In this case, you need to consider if single-arm trial with or without external control arms are necessary. And of course, all this consideration needs to be done with close collaboration with agency. Early advice with the agencies is key. And as part of the steps in designing and conducting of the studies, first, of course, feasibility approach, feasibility toolkit you could use in terms of assessing guidelines, published guidelines, also conducting feasibility assessment, like mentioned in previous slides, also feasibility assessment in terms of real-world data availability. All this will inform your draft protocol and analysis overview. And with this draft protocol, you can go with consultation with the agencies, and after receiving their feedback, only then we would advise to finalize protocol and proceed with the operational conduct of the study. And to summarize, number of marketing authorization applications to EMA and FDA with single-arm pivotal studies has been rising over the last decade. Regulators and payers have started to expect some kind of comparative analysis using real-world data to accompany single-arm trial submissions. But of course, in designing this kind of trials, and especially the ones using external control arms, number of methodological consideration needs to be taken into account in terms of selecting an appropriate data sources, defining eligibility criteria, study population, key endpoint, and confounding factors, using appropriate analytical tool, prior and thorough conduct of feasibility assessment, early discussions with regulators through scientific advice on the feasibility and acceptability of proposed methodology to meet regulatory HTA needs and legal requirements of trials. And of course, standardized lexicon, like we mentioned, and probably you already saw with all these examples provided, will definitely help in communicating the context of the study, and development of toolkits will assist in the choice of external control arm, planning, design, and conduct of the studies. Of course, while presentations may be nearing the end, the discussions and conversation near the end, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation with you. Here are our email contacts, and with this, this presentation is concluded, and we will be happy to address some of the audience questions in the remaining minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Artak.
Uh, that was great. So I think we have a few questions from the audience here. Uh, and the first question, Artak, would be, when do you conduct a feasibility? Before drafting up a protocol, or once the protocol is ready for discussion with the agencies?
Thank you for the question. And can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. So basically, feasibility is there to help drafting protocol. So what we would normally do, we would use trial protocol as a reference protocol. Then based on this trial protocol, we will draft outline of the protocol involving historical or external or any other type of external control arm study. And this outline protocol will define, for example, what kind of study population we need with definitions in terms of inclusion, exclusion criteria, what could be possible to operationalize in real world setting. Also, any endpoints with definition of endpoints, any sources of data, and this will help us to formulate questions which we would include in feasibility survey for our future assessment. And we will then draft feasibility survey, and we will conduct feasibility survey, and based on the feasibility survey report, we will finalize draft of the protocol. And only with this finalized draft of the protocol, we would advise to then go and discuss the protocol with agencies, because it will provide not only general methodological consideration, analysis, and so on, but it also will show that you conducted feasibility assessment, and these are the choices based on trial population, based on what we can operationalize in real world setting, and this could be very useful for your discussion in regulatory agencies.
There's another question I'll talk about, temporality of an external control arm. When you're designing an external control arm, how do you consider temporality? Are there any situations where you would want to, prefer a contemporaneous or a concurrent control arm versus a historical control arm?
This issue of time frame is one of the key issues, and it's extremely important to consider when considering different choices of whether it is contemporaneous control arm, historical control arm. Of course, the advice is to use time frame as close as possible to the trial population, and by definition, contemporaneous control arm would fit this requirement. However, we have to take into account some other consideration too. For example, it may not be always feasible to conduct contemporaneous control arm, especially via prospective recruitment, for the very reasons why RCTs may not be feasible. For example, very rarity of condition, the time it could have taken. And in this case, we saw in many examples, more frequently the use of historical control arm would be conducted. And however, even when conducting when deciding to use historical control arm, it's extremely important to make the feasibility assessment, especially in terms of standard of care, because one of the key reasons why we worried about this temporality is because of potential changes in standard of care and in terms of patient management, for example, diagnosis, treatment, and so on. So, and therefore, if it is a condition with very rapid changes of standard of care, the way patients manage, then historical control arm may not be useful. And also, when you are choosing the bigger time frame, it will be also always advisable to conduct number of sensitivity analysis. For example, stratifying by more recent data versus less recent data, and to see if it makes any differences into the results.
Yep. There's another question I'll talk about, any case studies or successes of using real world historical control arms with medical devices. Maybe I can address that. So, certainly on the HTA side, on the reimbursement side, the evidence for evidence that is evaluated for medical devices has taken into consideration evidence coming from real world historical controls, and there are many instances of mention of historical controls within, say, NICE appraisals, for example. I think this may be a slightly longer discussion in terms of discussing specific case studies. These case studies may be small center-based studies. So maybe we can take that discussion offline and connect up with the please feel free to connect up with us to discuss this further. So the next question, Artak, is around the reluctance of European HTAs to make any recommendations based on external control arms. Any thoughts around why that may be the case? In fact, we've seen that with the EMA as well. That the number of approvals given based on or a number of approvals that quote external control arms are far less than what the FDA would have done.
Yes, that's true. And we will also see number of guidances and in terms of number of initiatives also with FDA is much more. But I have to say that EMA also, it seems to catching up with their big data initiative, with, like mentioned, with some other guidances. They also, so in general, I would say there is a general trend of agencies becoming more open, more flexible in considering use of real-world evidence data in for regulatory purposes. But you are right. That's a good observation. It's for now FDA slightly, it seems more open for this than EMA, but I think the trend is going to the same direction.
Yeah. And from the HTA perspective, maybe to use the word reluctance maybe a bit strong here. I think it's more of I don't think they kind of ignore. They will ignore any compelling evidence. But if there is evidence that is generated with a compelling argument, it's all about making a case. So going on to the next question. What are the constraints using historical natural history data other than changes in routine care?
Yes, of course, changes of routine care is not the only constraint, because when using historical data, you are constrained with data already collected. So, and in this case, as a key consideration, for example, in terms of defining study populations, the way they defined endpoints, the way it is collected, availability of some key confounders may vary a lot. And so that's why this is one of the constraints will be, so you can only use as much as it is there because you are using data already collected. In terms of, for example, when it is prospective, contemporaneous control, it is possible to adapt data collection and to make it more suitable for trial. However, in historical control arm, it is already fixed, it is already there. And also some of the type of endpoints, depending on the endpoints collected in the trial. For example, patient reported outcome, it's highly unlikely that would be available using historical control data because these are rarely collected. Also, we can also maybe to extend a little bit this conversation, for example, some of the limitations can be also addressed during the thinking process while designing the trial. Say we want to match as closely historical trial population data as closely as possible in terms of study population to trial data. And for example, we have a number of cases we actually conducted, and especially in oncology settings, one of the requirements usually frequently inserted in the eligibility criteria of trials is a requirement of performance status. For example, in one of the studies we conducted, the requirement was to have ECOG performance status of patients. But we know that in real-world practice, it is not routinely collected, and we conducted feasibility assessment, and it actually proved our suspicions that and it shows that only very few centers actually collect this ECOG performance status, and also among those who collect it, they don't always collect this data at the time points required for the trial. And for this, we conducted further literature assessment to try to find any other evidence or some other comparable suitable performance status measurement. And we found, for example, that Karnofsky performance status could be used, and there is a very high correlation with it. Also, we found that in these particular settings, there were studies showing that for example, Charson comorbidity index could be used as highly correlated in performance status. And this, despite these limitations, so looking at some validated or clinically sound proxies and substitute could be also useful to consider. And I know, for example, we have these examples in other study settings too, not only in external control arm studies. For example, I know, Sumeet, there was a study in schizophrenia, which we successfully adapted, very flexible in terms of what can be used and what can be required for ages. Maybe perhaps you could provide a few brief this overview of this case study, which could be useful for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, it was more about developing relevant proxies that align with the clinical trial outcomes, and in this case, the outcomes that, or rather the variables that were in question were variables related to defining the severity of schizophrenia. And these would be things such as clinical scores, PAN scores that are given to schizophrenia patients. But in a real world setting, it would be very difficult to kind of get validated responses that have less variability, for example. So because many of these scores will have inter-rater variability and whatnot. So what we did was look for validated outcomes or validated variables that could serve as a proxy for schizophrenia, and it was in this case one of the proxies that came out as a very strong proxy was annual hospitalization rates for schizophrenia. So that was something that was used as a proxy variable, and at least from the HTA perspective, that was acceptable. So moving on, I think there's a question around the ideal, is there an ideal type of data source for external control arms? I think we can say that clearly there is none. But the interesting point here is, do you think that claims data can be used for development of external control arms?
This is a tough question because claims data has lots of potential, and depending what type of claims data also we're talking about. For example, claims data like French SNDS data, which we used a lot in our studies and which have almost nearly covering full French population, is very useful, contains very like a broad wealth of data, but in terms of more healthcare resource use, treatment patterns, and so on. For example, say if one of the endpoints is hospitalization or mortality, potentially you can use in terms of endpoints, for example, SNDS data, which they contain. However, let's not forget that it's not only about endpoints. We need to make sure we actually be able to define population. We actually need to make sure to have the comparable study population to then compare their endpoints. And in these cases, we know claims data lacking lots of important clinical variables and clinical nuances. And especially in these rare conditions for which single-arm trials are advised, they usually clinical trial population eligibility criteria is very specific, contains some specific clinical criteria which may not be and will not be available in usually claim data. But in this case, what we would advise definitely not to dismiss potential of the claims data like SNDS. I'm bringing these examples because it's a very good example, but actually to link it with other data sources, for example, with patients' chart review data, and we are conducting a number of studies in this regard. This, on one hand, this will increase the potential and richness of data and will allow to answer more detailed clinical questions using via linkage with patients' medical records. And also such linkages will allow potentially to develop and validate algorithms which will increase usability of claims data in future for other studies. For example, having reference as a medical chart data and then doing various validations in terms of algorithms and so on.
Yeah. So I think we're coming close to the end. Maybe one last question, one very quick response, Artak, if you can. So regarding the Tasveric case study, the question is about what does this say? What does the case study say about response-based real-world endpoints and FDA's attitude to use of external control arms in this setting?
It doesn't say so much about, in general, FDA's attitude about use of external control arms in this setting. It's more about choosing appropriate endpoints to compare, because like in some number of case studies, we show that it is extremely important. We need to make choices. What are the endpoints which we could operationalize properly in real world setting, and what endpoints we could not do it? For example, overall survival, probably we could do it. Objective response rate, we may not be able to properly do it using historical control because it requires number of other specific clinical evaluations at specific endpoints. So the question here is more about choosing more so-called more objective endpoints, which could be operational in real world setting.
Thank you very much, Artak, and thank you very much to the audience for listening in. Please feel free to reach out to us. Our contacts are on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking the presenters for their time and expertise. An additional thank you to all the attendees for participating and submitting your questions for discussion. The recording will be sent to registrants via email tomorrow and will also be available to view on demand in the ISPOR HEOR Solution Center. Thank you, everyone.